June 4th, 1942, 10:22 a.m. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led his formation of Kate torpedo bombers back toward the Japanese carrier fleet after attacking Midway Island. The strike had been partially successful, some damage inflicted on American installations, but not the devastating blow Japanese planners had hoped for. More importantly, Tomonaga's aircraft had taken damage. His fuel tank had been punctured by anti-aircraft fire. He was losing fuel steadily. Tomonaga radioed his carrier, Hiryu, requesting permission for emergency landing priority. The response came back negative. All four Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were in the middle of rearming and refueling aircraft on their hangar decks. Flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being prepared for a second strike wave. No carrier could recover aircraft until the rearming process was complete. Tomonaga understood the situation. Japanese carrier operations required careful coordination. You couldn't land aircraft while bombs and torpedoes were being loaded on the hangar deck. The risk of accidents was too high. He'd have to wait. His damaged aircraft would have to circle the fleet, burning precious fuel, until the carriers were ready to recover aircraft. Below him, the four Japanese carriers steamed in formation, protected by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This was the Kido Butai, the carrier striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The same carriers, the same commanders, the same aircraft that had crippled American naval power in the Pacific. But something was different now. American forces weren't surprised and unprepared like they'd been at Pearl Harbor. American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes and knew the attack on Midway was coming. American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were positioned northeast of Midway, waiting to ambush the Japanese fleet. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force from Akagi, faced a difficult tactical situation. His aircraft had attacked Midway but hadn't neutralized the island's defenses. A second strike would be necessary. But reconnaissance had just reported American ships, possibly including carriers northeast of the fleet. If American carriers were present, Japanese aircraft needed to be armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships, not the general-purpose bombs loaded for attacking Midway's installations. Nagumo ordered the rearming. Aircraft on the hangar decks were quickly stripped of their land attack ordnance and loaded with anti-ship weapons. The process was rushed. Ordnance was left scattered on hangar decks rather than being properly stored in magazines. Fuel lines were left connected to aircraft. The carriers were vulnerable during this changeover period, but Nagumo believed he had time. Japanese fighters were maintaining combat air patrol above the fleet. American attack aircraft attempting to reach the carriers would be intercepted and destroyed. What Nagumo didn't know was that American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were already approaching, climbing to attack altitude northwest of the fleet. And critically, Japanese combat air patrol fighters had been drawn down to low altitude by earlier American torpedo bomber attacks. The American torpedo bomber attacks had failed. Most torpedo bombers were shot down without hitting anything. But they'd accomplished something strategically important. They'd pulled Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving high altitude undefended. At 10:22 a.m., the same moment Tomonaga was requesting landing priority, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise spotted the Japanese carrier fleet. McCluskey had been searching for over an hour, his aircraft running low on fuel. He'd about to turn back when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the fleet. Following that wake, McCluskey found the carriers. He counted 4, all in relatively close formation. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. Perfect targets. McCluskey split his formation, assigning some squadrons to attack Akagi and Kaga. Moments later, dive bombers from Yorktown arrived and targeted Soryu. Japanese lookouts spotted the American dive bombers at 10:24 a.m., just 2 minutes after McCluskey had spotted the carriers. Warnings were shouted. Sirens sounded. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but the American dive bombers were already diving from 15,000 feet, approaching at steep angles that made them difficult targets for anti-aircraft gunners trained primarily to defend against level bombers and torpedo attacks. The first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck at 10:26 a.m., penetrating to the hangar deck where aircraft were being rearmed. The bomb detonated among aircraft, aviation fuel, and ordnance scattered across the hangar deck. Secondary explosions followed as torpedoes and bombs on the hangar deck detonated. Fire spread immediately, fed by aviation fuel from aircraft fuel tanks and fuel lines that hadn't been disconnected. Within minutes, Akagi, flagship of the carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor, was burning uncontrollably. The ship's fire suppression systems couldn't handle fires of this intensity. Damage control teams fought desperately to contain the flames, but explosions kept erupting as more ordnance cooked off from the heat. Kaga was hit by multiple bombs almost simultaneously with Akagi. The results were identical: penetrating hits to the flight and hangar decks, detonations among rearming aircraft, cascading secondary explosions, uncontrollable fires. Within 10 minutes of the first bomb hit, Kaga was a burning wreck. Soryu took 3 direct hits. Like its sister carriers, Soryu had aircraft being rearmed on its hangar deck. The bombs penetrated to the hangar, detonated among armed and fueled aircraft, and triggered secondary explosions that gutted the ship. Soryu's captain ordered the crew to abandon ship within 20 minutes of the first hit. The fires were so intense that remaining aboard meant certain death.
Lieutenant Tomonaga, still circling above the fleet with his damaged aircraft, watched 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers transform into burning wrecks in less than 10 minutes. The Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier force in the world just minutes earlier, had been devastated by a single coordinated dive bomber attack. Japanese fighter pilots flying combat air patrol were equally stunned. They'd been engaged at low altitude against American torpedo bombers when the dive bombers struck. By the time they climbed back to altitude, it was too late. The American dive bombers had already released their bombs and were diving away at high speed, difficult to intercept. Only Hiryu remained operational. The 4th carrier had been positioned farther from the other 3 and had escaped the initial attack. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamadichi, commanding from Hiryu, immediately ordered a counterstrike. Japanese aircraft still airborne, including Tomonaga's damaged bomber, were directed to land on Hiryu despite the crowded deck. Additional aircraft were launched to attack the American carriers that had just destroyed 3/4 of Japan's striking force. Tomonaga's aircraft approached Hiryu for landing. His fuel situation was critical. The punctured tank had been leaking throughout the battle. He made his approach, landed successfully, and taxied clear of the landing area. Ground crews rushed to his aircraft to assess the damage and begin refueling for the counterstrike. But even as Hiryu launched counterattacks against the American carriers, Japanese naval officers throughout the fleet were beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. 3 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning and would likely be lost. These weren't just any carriers. They were the core of Japan's carrier aviation capability. They'd conducted the Pearl Harbor attack. They dominated the Pacific for 6 months, and they'd been destroyed in approximately 6 minutes of American dive bombing. The tactical situation for Japan had reversed catastrophically. Japan had begun the battle with 4 carriers and approximately 240 aircraft. America had 3 carriers with approximately 230 aircraft. The forces had been roughly equal. Now Japan had 1 operational carrier with perhaps 70 to 80 aircraft remaining. America still had 3 carriers and the majority of its aircraft. The numerical advantage had shifted overwhelmingly in America's favor. Hiryu's counterstrikes achieved partial success. Japanese aircraft damaged Yorktown severely enough that the American carrier had to be abandoned later. But the cost was high. Most of the attacking Japanese aircraft were shot down by American fighters or anti-aircraft fire. And critically, attacking Yorktown didn't restore Japan's lost carriers. By early afternoon, American dive bombers located Hiryu. The pattern repeated. Bombs penetrated the flight and hangar decks. Secondary explosions erupted among armed and fueled aircraft. Fire spread uncontrollably. By 5 p.m., Hiryu was burning as intensely as the other 3 carriers. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship rather than evacuate. Japanese pilots who survived the battle and returned to other ships in the fleet, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that could recover seaplanes or had enough deck space for emergency landings, reported what they'd witnessed with shock and disbelief. The 4 carriers that had seemed invincible that morning were gone. All 4. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the heart of Japanese naval aviation, had been destroyed in a single day. Admiral Nagumo, evacuated from the burning Akagi to a cruiser, initially considered pressing the attack despite the carrier losses. Japan still had battleships and cruisers. Perhaps a night surface action could salvage something from the disaster. But without carrier air cover, surface ships approaching Midway would be vulnerable to American land-based aircraft and the remoting American carriers. The risk was too great. Nagumo ordered withdrawal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the overall Midway operation from the battleship Yamato far to the west, received reports of the carrier losses throughout the afternoon and evening of June 4th. Initially, he hoped 1 or 2 carriers might be salvaged. As reports clarified the extent of the damage, he realized all 4 were doomed. On June 5th, Yamamoto ordered the entire fleet to withdraw. The Midway operation was a failure. For Japanese naval aviators, the realization of what had happened at Midway came gradually. The immediate shock of seeing carriers burning was followed by understanding of the strategic implications. Japan had built 6 fleet carriers before the war: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 2 carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had been damaged in previous battles and were unavailable for Midway. 4 carriers had been committed to Midway. All 4 were lost. Japan now had 2 operational fleet carriers. America had 3, plus industrial capacity to build more carriers far faster than Japan could. The carrier balance in the Pacific had shifted from approximate parity to overwhelming American advantage in a single day. Lieutenant Tomonaga had survived the landing on Hiryu despite his fuel situation. He'd volunteered to lead Hiryu's counterstrike against the American carriers even though his aircraft was damaged and he knew he probably wouldn't have enough fuel to return. Tomonaga led the attack on Yorktown, scored hits on the American carrier, and died when his damaged aircraft was shot down by American fighters. He never learned that Hiryu had been destroyed hours after he'd launched the attack. Japanese pilots who survived Midway and were rescued by destroyers or submarines were transferred to other ships and eventually returned to Japan. They carried with them the knowledge that Japan's carrier superiority, the foundation of Japanese naval strategy in the Pacific, had been lost. The 6-month period of Japanese dominance that Admiral Yamamoto had predicted after Pearl Harbor had ended exactly on schedule. Back in Japan, the Midway defeat was concealed from the public. Newspapers weren't informed of the carrier losses. Survivors were ordered not to discuss what had happened. The fiction was maintained that Japan was winning the Pacific War. But within the Japanese military, officers understood the truth. Midway had been a catastrophic defeat that fundamentally changed the strategic balance.
Japanese naval aviation never recovered from Midway. The loss of 4 carriers was devastating, but the loss of experienced pilots and aircrew was equally damaging. Many of Japan's most skilled carrier aviators had died at Midway, either going down with their carriers or shot down during attacks on American ships. Replacing carriers took years. Replacing experienced pilots took even longer. By contrast, American carrier construction accelerated throughout 1942 and 1943. New Essex-class fleet carriers entered service at rates approaching 1 per month. American pilot training programs expanded, producing thousands of trained aviators. American aircraft production overwhelmed Japanese capacity. The industrial advantage that Admiral Yamamoto had warned about before Pearl Harbor was now manifesting in devastating fashion. The Battle of Midway lasted 3 days, June 4 through 7, 1942. But the decisive moment occurred in approximately 6 minutes on the morning of June 4th when American dive bombers struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu simultaneously. In those 6 minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted permanently. Japanese pilots circling above the burning carriers at 10:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, witnessed the moment Japan lost the Pacific War. They didn't know all these strategic implications yet. They didn't understand how American industrial capacity would overwhelm Japanese replacements, but they understood that the 4 carriers burning below them represented something irreplaceable. And they understood that the war they'd been winning for 6 months had just turned against them. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who'd led the Pearl Harbor attack and was aboard Akagi during Midway, though injured and unable to fly, watched his flagship burn and later wrote, "The loss of those 4 carriers at Midway was the beginning of the end. We'd lost our offensive capability. We'd lost our advantage. We'd lost the war, though it took 3 more years for that to become fully apparent." June 4th, 1942, 10:26 a.m. The moment the first bomb struck Akagi. The moment Japanese pilots realized their carriers were doomed. The moment the Pacific War turned decisively against Japan.